I'm going to give some comments in a moment, but I'm going to first invite our CEO, Duncan Harris, to come up and give a welcome greeting. So give him a hand.
So good morning, everybody. Good morning. Okay, this is a big day for us, right? And so I wanted to share a few remarks, and Jeff gets nervous whenever I get a mic and a captive audience, but I promise to be brief. But I do have a few things to suggest. So this is Duncan Harris. I'm the CEO of the college. I started my 4th year, and so some folks said that the honeymoon's been over. There's been a few things that have happened, and so year 4 certainly. But I love this place, and and I think that this project that we're embarking on is indicative of the type of place that it is and the type of place that it can become, that we have some aspirational goals that we haven't accomplished yet that this is leading to. Last week, Jeff and I had the fortune to spend an hour with Sarah Lewis, who will be our inaugural speaker for the Pennington Lecture Series, which we'll have to give you a sense of the stature of it. We talk about the history and power that this project, the potential that it has. And I was walking in, like many of you this morning, past a location that certainly doesn't currently identify the history for over 200 years that has occurred on this hallowed ground, right? Little quick story. I'm in my 50s now, but when I was in my 20s, I attended the University of Connecticut, and I had the fortune to spend my spring break 1 year at Hampton University. And so, I like many, I always regret not attending an HBCU, and attended UConn, great school. I bleed Husky blue, but I think many of us that attended PWIs oftentimes wonder about the magic that occurs on our nation's historically black colleges and universities. And so I was at Hampton University, and kind of running around, me and a couple, one of my buddies, we're alphas, and so we were hanging out with some of the brothers down there. And they have a location on campus where there's this big tree, and it's just a big tree to somebody like me, not aware of the history that it embodies. And that is the Emancipation Oak, which is recognized as one of the world's 10 most important trees. And during the Civil War, slaves went to learn under that tree on the campus. And the Hampton, those of you that are aware, later became a teacher's college, and that was where its foundation. And so they have a ritual where no one walks on that ground until you graduate, based in honoring their ancestors and the power. So you can imagine, the scholars that K. Booker T. Washington attended Hampton University. And so fast forward to what we're embarking on and what occurred on this space with the first black church and first black school in our state. And for years, we've been in this building, 19 years now. Next year it'll be our 20, so we could tie some things into that. But every day we walk past this location that's undefined. No one knows about it. And so with this project, and what we're very excited about, is elevating the scholarship, the social justice work, and the power of this most hallowed ground that we stand on and come to every day. And so I'm looking at my faculty and this power of what we can do. We launched a mentoring program, brother to brother and sister to sister. They'll be going to the State House, and they have a ritual they've created around the Amistad that they'll be kicking off this year. But imagine what we can do and how we can tether what's occurred on this hallowed ground to the scholarship and the work that we do. Capital is an anti-poverty institution. We are a poverty disruptor. I'm not sure what other organizations in Hartford have as much potential as we do to disrupt poverty. You know, depending on the index, some might suggest Hartford is the 4th poorest city in the nation. And depending on the zip codes, right? So certain zip codes might be average median household income $25,000 to $30,000. However, and based on the heels of what occurred last year and some of the things that we decided to do as an institution and do more and better of, is that we recognize our power as an economic engine. We've had studies done that we're in the top 5% of community colleges in the nation with regard to moving students up 2 income quartiles. Right? And that's a Harvard study that was done. Anna Stansberry did some work with us from the School of Education in Harvard about what we do here, the magic that we do. And so we disrupt poverty. And somebody who comes from 06120, who completes cybersecurity, or our state's largest nursing program, or architecture, I'm looking at here, what that does for them and their families, and so on. And so I'm immensely excited about what we're going to do with this project and this grant. The last thing that I'll say is I wanted to honor Jeff Partridge, right? And so I started, like I said, this is year 3 or 4, and the average tenure of a current president is about 5 years. I'm not going anywhere, but so this is, you know, I'm certainly finding my stride. But the year 1, Jeff took me on his arm, introduced me, and talked to me about the Hartford Heritage Project. This project itself is the genesis of some work of our students, right? And this original scholarship that they originated. And so when Jeff was, and we were applying for the National Endowment for the Humanities grant, you know, we were talking about who would lead this project, right? And this is once again on the heels of and Jeff kind of had a call with me, and we're very close now, I would suggest. And he said, you know, hey, Duncan, you know, and I could tell where he was headed. He's like, well, should I be the head of this? You know, as a white male, you know, leading this initiative that focuses on Black history and the power of the church and the first school and things like that. And without hesitation, I said, of course, Jeff, yes. Right? And what I know to be true about Jeff as an English professor here, and one of the things I'll say about our faculty come specifically to work here with our 36% Black students, perhaps the Blackest school, our version of an HBCU, right? And so when he asked that question, I had no doubt that he was the right individual because of the Black scholars that he has committed his life to creating, that he will use this project to continue that work. And so I wanted to honor Jeff, and I'm so excited. This is an exciting day for him and for our entire institution. And so with that, and I apologize, I'll be in and out. We got a lot going on right now, but I'm going to treat myself to these lectures today. So I'll be in here as much as I can, but I'm just so excited about this. Is a big day in the history of our institution, and I'm glad to celebrate it with all of you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Next up is Pastor Cleo Graham of Faith Congregational Church. I'm sure you all know that Talcott Street Congregational Church, please be careful with your step there, that Faith is the continuation of Talcott Street Congregational Church. So this is the church still living today that we are learning about. And we're going to be visiting there later today. I've had some wonderful visits with Pastor Cleo and her husband Melvin, who's here too. Thank you for joining us, Melvin. And with their history committee, you're going to meet the people today when we get there. It's a warm, inviting environment and some remarkable history that we're going to walk into today. And I'm really pleased that we have Pastor Cleo here to address us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And thank you, Jeff, for your comments, and also Duncan Harris for your comments. You know, it's so interesting when I get to meet people in the flesh, when I have met you also in the spirit and seen some of your photos at our churches, heard people talk about the both of you, and that is so powerful. Let me just begin by saying that when I first arrived here in November from Rhode Island, when I accepted the call to this church, I wasn't quite sure where Talcott Street Church was, because I could not find a symbol of it. And that disturbed me terribly. But at the same time, I heard about Jeff, I met Jeff, I heard about the project, and I said, okay, there is Talcott Church. It's in the heart, it's in the history. That's where it is. Maybe we don't need flags or symbols, but we need people to tell the story. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking on the task of telling the story. Again, I begin by representing Faith Congregational Church, AKA Talcott Church. This church has had many names, but the people are the same. What I mentioned yesterday at the Amistad opening, I said it's in the blood. It's part of our DNA to tell this story and to further the story. One of the very particular things that have happened is that Reverend Pennington was very involved with the Amistad movement. And that in itself is a story that can go on for years. I just want to mention a word that captivated me about Reverend Dr. Pennington. He said that it is a sin to hold a man in slavery. And if you enslave a man, you do not only rob him of his own dear liberty and happiness, but you rob God of his right as creator and redeemer of that man. And what does this constitute but a sin? This is such a powerful message. And so I want to, though, thank you for cutting the chains and liberating Reverend Dr. James Pennington's legacy. Because today, as you boldly release him and release his story, you shine a light on an American story, an American history. This is not Black history. This is an American story. And so it feels great today to be an American, to be part of this story, and to be a part of Faith Congregational Church. I can tell you that today mostly the seniors have gone through this church, and I said, I want you to tell the story. But tell the story in terms of images, in terms of words, so that when people walk through this church, they can see the story without even hearing it per se. And so this has brought us so much joy to be able to share this story about Reverend Pennington in such a profound way. And it's not a Hartford story, it's not a Connecticut story, it's the United States of America, it's an American story. And so thank you so much, and I hope to get to know each and every one of you. God bless you and keep you.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Cleo. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just say a couple of words about this momentous occasion. If you look at, I didn't plan this obviously because I didn't even know this existed. Marcus, there's one of these that Duncan has there. If you look at this brochure, about 80% of the photos are from the Hartford Heritage Project. In the very back, where it says unique to Capitol, it's a description of the Hartford Heritage Project. Connecting course content to culture and history in Capitol's neighborhood. Imagine being part of an HHP class that reads a play, sees a play, and meets the actors, researches headstones in the ancient burying ground, refreshes critical observation skills among famous paintings at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, studies the Industrial Revolution through Sam Colt's artifacts. That's you, Marcus. tours the neighboring homes of Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, visits urban farms to talk about food deserts. And we can add one on here, learning about the Talcott Street Congregational Church and School for Black Children. This is what we're doing today as part of the Hartford Heritage Project. It's born of the same idea, and it's patterned in the same way. 10 years ago, 1 decade, a group of educators sat in this room, and some of them are here today as well, to embark on an NEH-sponsored grant project called the Hartford Heritage Project. And today, 10 years later, a group of educators sits in this room ready to embark on a project that, like the Hartford Heritage Project, can transform what we do here at the college. The aim of the Black Heritage Project is to bring the history of these amazing people, these courageous people who are this cloud of witnesses that came before us, right? To bring them out of the shadows, their stories out of the shadows, and into the lived experience of our college. For us, for staff, for faculty, and especially for our students. Your task, which I just admire you for taking this on. I know how busy we are as faculty. This is a big endeavor, but what you're doing is you are going to be transforming curriculum and passing that on to other faculty so that it will be impossible for a student to go through this college and not know about this church, and not know about its history, not know about its presence, and not know about the people, the school, the education, everything that it stands for. So I applaud you for taking on this task, and we are embarking now on what I think is going to be quite an adventure. And it's going to be exciting. We're going to get to know each other even more. That's exactly what happened with the Hartford Heritage Project. It's going to be a really great adventure. So I thank you for joining me in that. I do want to say that I have a bag of masks, so if anybody loses a mask or shows up without one or you need another one, I have capital masks. We will be going from here after our first speaker. We're going to be going to the Old State House, and then Steve Thornton, who is here, is going to lead us on his tour that will take us through some historic places in Hartford related to the church and its history. Then we'll end up at the Old State House. We'll have a lecture there. The lecture will not be in person today because Andrew Walsh was exposed to someone in his family who then came down with COVID later this week. So we decided not to have him give that lecture in person, but he'll be doing that from Zooming in. That will be at the Old State House. We'll have lunch during that time. As we listen to that, we'll have a tour of the Old State House, and then we'll end up at Faith Congregational Church, where we're going to get a tour by some of the history committee members there. So it's an exciting day. Most of you are curriculum writers here, but we do have people who are involved in the program otherwise. Fiona Vernal, if you haven't met her yet, is going to be one of our speakers. Put up your hand. Fiona is, Dr. Vernal is from the UConn history department, the same as Dr. Sinha, who will be speaking shortly. Also, we have Olivia Chang, who is joining us from Manchester Community College. She was really eager to be a part of what we're doing here, so we're happy to be able to share this with her. And so she's joining us as well. I think that's it for kind of logistics. Mariana is here as well from the Old State House, so do say hi to her when you get a chance. All right, I'm sure you were daunted by this brick. But what a book, huh? I mean, we are really privileged to have Manisha Sinha with us today. Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction. She was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. Is that Columbia or India? What's it? You didn't shout up. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics, and Ideology in Antebellum, South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015, and recently featured in the New York Times 1619 Project. Her multiple award-winning second monograph, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for nonfiction. It was named Editor's Choice in the New York Times Book Review, Book of the Week by Times Higher Education to coincide with its UK publication, one of the 3 great history books of 2016 in Bloomberg News. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, and I'll skip down to this delight right here. She is the 8th recipient of the James W.C. Pennington Award for 2021 from the University of Heidelberg, which is where he received his doctorate. Yes. So join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Manisha Sinha.
Is it all right? Yes, I am fully vaccinated and always masked, so. Thank you, Jeff, for that very generous introduction and for having me here today to speak with you. It's really a pleasure to be here and just to see the wonderful work that the college is doing in terms of resurrecting the history, relatively forgotten history of Black activism, abolitionist activism in the city that remains, I think, an inspiration for all of us. So I'm delighted to be here, and I apologize that we began a few minutes late. I think I was circling the Talcott Street garage, Morgan Street garage. I nearly went to the Talcott Street garage for a long time before I found my way and before my colleague, Professor Vernal, rescued me. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm not a historian of the state of Connecticut or the city of Hartford. And many of you here know more about these subjects than I do. But I am a historian of abolition. And I would like to place the history and significance of Hartford's abolitionists, particularly Black abolitionists, in the broader context of the anti-slavery movement. Abolition, as I have argued in that break that Jeff showed you, was, I should say, there's a lot of front and back matter and illustrations in that book. It's not a difficult read. So abolition, as I have argued in that book, was a radical interracial social movement whose foot soldiers were ordinary men and women, Black and white. Moreover, African Americans, free and enslaved, were at the vanguard of abolition. At least that's my argument. While contesting for their own freedom and rights, they helped determine the tactics and ideology of the movement. Now, Connecticut, which was a post-slavery society, like much of the North before the Civil War, was a breeding ground for abolitionist activism, despite the persistence of racism and racial discrimination. The very first abolitionists in the States were arguably people of African descent who challenged their enslavement. The history of abolition in Hartford and Connecticut goes back to the 18th century, when the first wave of abolition helped propel the gradual emancipation of enslaved people in the northern states. Now, as in the more well-known case of Massachusetts, people of African descent sued and petitioned for their freedom, helping to lay the groundwork for the abolition of slavery in Connecticut. Enslaved African Americans employed various anti-slavery strategies. With the help of sympathetic whites, they brought freedom suits against their masters on various grounds: Christianization, verbal or written agreements granting freedom, self-purchase, ill usage and brutality, or evidence of white ancestry. In 1703, a, quote, mulatto slave in Connecticut, Abda, successfully sued to gain his freedom. Enslaved people won their freedom by suing their masters from Virginia to New Hampshire in the colonial era. There is a long prehistory to the famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 of enslaved people suing for their freedom. And it's a history that we've forgotten. And it's a history that is particularly pertinent to New England and Connecticut. Outside the realm of law, slave resistance in the form of runaways or fugitivity, the search for free spaces was ubiquitous throughout this time. Pick up any colonial newspaper, including the Hartford Courant, founded in 1764, and you will invariably find advertisements for fugitive slaves, a silent testimony to Black people voting with their feet to gain their freedom. And you can see some of these advertisements that the Courant put up recently in their project exploring their history and enslavement in Hartford, and many of these are from the 1780s. They're of young Black men and women, usually in their 20s, escaping enslavement. There's another case here of a Black man married to what they call, quote, an Indian squaw, an Indian woman. And I think more research actually needs to be done for Hartford and Connecticut to look at the interconnections between Native Americans and African Americans and the intermingling of those two communities in the way that it has been done for Rhode Island. Now, during the American Revolution, Connecticut Blacks, like their counterparts elsewhere in New England, took advantage of the revolutionary ferment to petition colonial assemblies for their freedom. In 1774, a petition from the slaves of a loyalist slaveholder to the Connecticut General Assembly questioned the legitimacy of their enslavement on racist grounds. Quote, though they have flat noses, crooked shins, and other queerness of make, peculiar to Africans, are yet of the human race, freeborn in our own country, taken from thence by man-stealers, and sold in this country like cattle in the market, without the least act of our own to forfeit liberty. The Black petitioners gauged their audience well, invoking the biblical injunction against man-stealing, sure to appeal to the assembly. They also evoked revolutionary ideology, arguing that as good, quote, Whigs, they should be set free to serve the patriot cause, and cheekily suggested that their Tory master should instead be enslaved. Another enslaved man from Norwalk, Pomp, also petitioned the assembly for his freedom, based on the fact that his master had deserted to the British. He could, quote, well provide for himself and his wife, a free woman, and her child. The Connecticut Assembly granted Pomp his freedom. Now, besides Black activism on the ground, early Black print culture also gives us a window into the nature of Black abolitionism. As many of you here know, the first slave narrative published in the early American Republic was written by a Black man from Connecticut, Venture Smith. And there were earlier slave narratives that were published in Britain and during the colonial era, but Smith's is the first one published in the independent Republic. Now, Smith notes his African American identity in the title of his narrative, pictured here, describing himself as, quote, a native of Africa, but resident about 60 years in the United States of America. A former Connecticut slave, Smith, originally Brotier of Dukundara in Africa, was enslaved at the age of 8. Published in 1798, his narrative is rarely read as an abolitionist tract. The preface written by his scribe Elisha Niles, a Connecticut school teacher, however, laid out its anti-slavery purpose. Smith, Niles observed, was a Black founder, comparable to Franklin and Washington. As a historian of abolition, I would argue that Smith was not so much a Black founder as a Black founding critic of the slaveholding republic, and his story of the American founding was a counter-narrative of slavery and racial oppression. Smith's spare narrative of the commodification of Africans as property is an indictment of the worldwide system of commerce that included the Atlantic slave trade and the slave society that he came to inhabit in British North America. Unlike Olaudah Equiano, the Afro-British abolitionist, who dwelt on the horrors of the Middle Passage in his slave narrative, and that was published just a bit before in the 1780s in Britain, Smith recounted in detail the broad swath of destruction and indiscriminate enslavement of entire villages by a fierce band of African warriors and kidnappers. Cognizant of the broader forces that motivated them, he writes, quote, "They were instigated by some white nation who equipped them and sent them to subdue and possess the country." Like contemporary abolitionists in the 18th century, Smith eschewed simplistic racial analysis and instead pointed out how his African enslavers' lust for wealth led them to participate in the enslavement process and in the torture and murder of his father. The very name he is given by his first white enslaver, Venture, he's bought for 4 gallons of rum and some calico, illustrates his transformation into human capital. Smith relates how many times he was, quote, pawned, hired, sold, and told of his superhuman efforts to escape slavery and poverty. His is not the story of a, quote, venture capitalist, as some scholars claim, but of a laboring man, one who carefully kept track of the amount and type of work he did in order to buy his and his family's freedom. It is the value of his labor that Smith cherished, revealing how employers constantly cheated their workers, especially if they were enslaved and black. His narrative is a powerful indictment of slavery as the denial of the fruits of one's labor. Thus, Smith's grief at the death of his son is compounded by the fact that he lost the money he had paid for his freedom. He also mentions the amount paid to the doctor for his dying daughter, underscoring that only the rich have the luxury and good taste to indulge in sentiment over hard emotional and material losses. Smith also unveils the underside of market society, where dishonesty and finagling rules. His master charges him an enormous sum for his freedom, and an Irish servant steals from him and 2 other runaways, foiling their plot to escape. Smith buys fellow slaves out of slavery to either liberate them or have them work with him. But they also cheat him. Courts, contracts, and market rules did not dispense justice, but sided with wealthy and powerful whites. When he was made to pay a client for damages, Smith remarks, quote, "But Captain Hart was a white gentleman, and I a poor African. Therefore it was all right and good enough for the black dog," unquote. Now, forced to play by rules stacked against him, Smith, despite his achievements, determines that working men and black men like him in particular will always be the losers. His is no uplifting tale of liberation, but a revelation of the hypocrisy and unfairness of the world governed by the cash nexus, or in his words, where Africans and their freedoms could be converted, quote, into cash. Smith died in 1805, and his tombstone, pictured, I just got the top there, and it's been recently renovated. There's been a lot of attention, of course, as you know, on Venture Smith. His tombstone captures his sense of the injustice of his enslavement and his pride in the labor that helped him buy his freedom. Quote, "Sacred to the memory of Venture Smith, an African, though the son of a king, he was kidnapped and sold but by his industry acquired money to purchase his freedom." Smith's narrative, in fact, encapsulates the 2-pronged strategy that would be adopted by black abolitionists in Connecticut and throughout the North and elsewhere, the dual fight against slavery, but also for racial equality in this country. Closer to home, one of the earliest black abolitionists was Reverend Lemuel Haynes, born right here in West Hartford. Now, I have been told that he doesn't count as a black abolitionist from Hartford because he spent much of his life ministering to a church in Vermont, but I beg to disagree. Haynes, a congregational minister, counts as one of the earliest Hartford abolitionists. In the 19th century, Haynes was viewed as an heir to a long line of pious and gifted Africans, including Cyprian and Augustine, and his works were seen as a means to, quote, mitigate the unreasonable prejudices against the Africans in our land. Abandoned by his white mother and an unknown black father, Haynes was a self-taught indentured servant and preached his first sermon to his master's devout family. He volunteered as a Minuteman in 1774 and served in the Continental Army in 1776 until he was discharged for ill health. We, of course, know that many black men served in the Continental Army from Connecticut and New England. Haynes' ballad celebrating the Battle of Lexington was published in 1775 and reveals that he experienced the Revolution as, quote, an enfranchising experience. In case you're wondering, the top there is a marker put up in Vermont describing his life very briefly. But Haynes inserted a critique of slavery in an otherwise conventional narrative of New England history. Quote, for liberty, he tells his readers, each freeman strives as it's a gift of God and would rather pay for it with blood than live the life of a, quote, surviving slave. Haynes gives vent to his abolitionist views in a 1776 essay titled Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping. Though never published, probably because of its abolitionist message, it was influenced by the great Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet, who Haynes quoted liberally. Haynes asked every, quote, son of freedom, as they engaged in this important struggle, the American Revolution, to, quote, turn one eye into our own breast for a little moment and see whether through some inadvertency or a self-contracted spirit we do not find the monster tyranny lurking in our own bosom. Everyone acknowledged, he wrote, that, quote, an Englishman has a right to his liberty, but an African also has an undeniable right to his liberty. Consequently, the practice of slave keeping, which so much abounds in this land, is illicit, unquote. Color, he further averred, should not be the, quote, decisive criterion to deprive one of natural rights, as, quote, whence is it that an Englishman is so far distinguished from an African in point of natural privilege? The condition of black people in the New World, he concluded, is, quote, hell upon earth, and all this for filthy lucre's sake. Haynes not only made good use of revolutionary ideology to critique slavery, like many abolitionists of the first wave of abolition, whom I describe in the book, but he also argued that slavery put mammon before humans and God. He ends his pamphlet with an address to slaveholders and condemns their hypocrisy by evoking the authority of the Bible. Quote, therefore is it not high time to undo these heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free? He warns of an abolitionist revolution, like an early day John Brown, who, by the way, was also born in Connecticut, Torrington. Quote, while you thus sway your tyrant scepter over others, you have nothing to expect but to share in the bitter pill. And he warns, if they did not break these intolerable yokes, they would find it around their own necks. Now, the notion that the enslaved were instruments of divine vengeance reflected both Haynes' revolutionary Republican views as well as his orthodox Calvinism. After his service in the Revolutionary War, Haynes worked for clergymen, acquiring instruction in Latin, Greek, and theology. In 1783, he married a school teacher, Elizabeth Babbitt, and was ordained 2 years later. Haynes was closely associated with the New Divinity views of Jonathan Edwards and the abolitionist minister Samuel Hopkins. He acquired the approval of President Timothy Dwight of Yale for challenging the liberal theology of Hosea Ballou, who rejected the doctrine of original sin in his widely reprinted Universal Salvation. Haynes' theological opponents never failed to draw attention to his color in their rejoinders. It would be the relatively conservative New Divinity clergyman Levi Hart's 1775 plan for gradual emancipation that would eventually be adopted by Connecticut. Hart suggested that slaves serve their masters until the age of 24 or 25 to compensate them for their education, and that masters receive compensation in exact proportion to the amount of labor lost to them. And he developed a mathematical table that actually tied compensation to the age of the slave freed. The Connecticut legislature adopted Hart's plan, except that it freed only the children of slaves and offered no compensation to masters. In 1784, the state, following Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, passed a gradual emancipation law that freed children of slaves born after March 1st of that year at the age of 25, considerably older than the ages prescribed in the Rhode Island gradual emancipation law that was passed the same year in 1784. Now, opposition to emancipation, even in this very gradual and conservative manner, came from most Connecticut slaveholders. James Mars, pictured here, a term slave born in 1790, repeatedly ran away, once with his family, to prevent being taken to Virginia by their enslaver, a Reverend Thompson, who was married to a Virginian woman. The white citizens of Norfolk hid the Mars family, who eluded capture, and his parents eventually refused to go to Virginia or allow their sons to be transported there. Thompson eventually sold James Mars for the rest of his term to a farmer who did not hesitate to whip him. While Mars eventually had to pay his master $90 to be released from his service, white indentured servants, he noted in his narrative, received $100, a Bible, and 2 new suits at the end of their term. Mars published his narrative during the Civil War for, quote, many of the people who do not know that slavery ever lived in Connecticut. The state had to pass laws in 1788 and 1792 to prevent the sale of term as well as lifetime slaves in the African slave trade and to the South. In 1797, it reduced the age of freedom for term slaves from 25 to 21. Only as late as 1848 did Connecticut finally abolish slavery outright, as Haynes had demanded. Slavery gradually decayed in the state and eventually disappeared. The long struggle against slavery's afterlives and racism was led by Connecticut's abolitionists, especially the black abolitionists of Hartford. In 1790, anti-slavery whites, mainly lawyers and ministers, founded the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Unlawfully Held in Bondage, modeled after the famous Pennsylvania Abolition Society, founded by the Quakers, and then Benjamin Franklin was the president of that society before he died. The society, this is the Connecticut Society, oversaw the transition from slavery to freedom in the state, making sure that its emancipation laws were enforced. Now, like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, it also encouraged black education and helped to find employment for freed people in order to mint them as citizens of the new republic. While the paternalism of these early white abolitionists could be grating to a newly freed people, they could provide invaluable assistance in cases of wrongful enslavement and kidnapping of free blacks that happened throughout this period, right up to the famous case of Solomon Northrop. The society also effectively lobbied the legislature in the 1790s to pass legislation to secure emancipation in the state. In 1791, the anti-clerical Republican lawyer Zephaniah Swift, in his address to the State Society in Hartford, decried the United States as, quote, the theater of most extensive slavery, and railed that, quote, the black native of the burning climes of Africa and the copper-colored savages of the wilds of America have long mourned the day Columbus sailed from Europe. The Connecticut Society praised the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue, the start of the Haitian Revolution, and sent a petition to Congress criticizing, quote, the unhappy policy of this country to impose slavery and want on those who are brought from Africa, while we hold forth the prospects of liberty and plenty to immigrants from all other countries. In 1791, the Connecticut abolitionist Abraham Bishop wrote a 3-part series, The Rights of Black Men, in defense of the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue. Linking the black fight for freedom to the American Revolution, he asked, quote, is not their cause as just as ours? He castigated the new American Republic, where, quote, blacks are still enslaved, the Indians are driven into the society of savage beasts, and we glory in the equal rights of men, provided that we white men can enjoy the whole of them, unquote. Now, unfortunately, abolitionism in Connecticut declined by the early 19th century, and with the ascendancy of Jeffersonian Republicans, which was a kind of a Southern tilting party as opposed to the Federalists, this is the first party system, with their ascendancy in state politics. Many whites, including the state's leading ministers like Reverends Lyman Beecher and Leonard Bacon, joined the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816 on the plan to colonize all free blacks in the west coast of Africa, what eventually became the American colony of Liberia. And this was a whites-only organization. This is a membership certificate of the Colonization Society. It included in its membership, congressmen, presidents, prominent whites, both North and South, and prominent clergymen too from Connecticut. An overwhelming majority of black leaders opposed colonization, preferring to stay in the land they had watered with their blood and tears, and refusing to abandon, quote, their southern brethren in slavery. Unlike black abolitionists, colonizationists imagined a lily-white republic and could not accept African Americans as equal citizens in the republic. The ascendancy of colonization sentiment in the state gave it the reputation of being the Georgia of New England. 2 years later, Connecticut became the first northern state to disenfranchise black men after widening the franchise for white men. Now, a lot of people see this as a democratic moment in Connecticut history because it broadens the franchise and it disestablishes the Congregational Church. But for black men, it was a decidedly undemocratic moment. The state was well on its way to becoming a part of the white man's democracy in antebellum America. With the rise of the second wave of abolition, interracial immediatism, or Garrisonian abolition in the 1830s, Connecticut was home to some of the worst anti-abolitionist racist violence, with mass opposition to a black college in New Haven and the destruction of Prudence Crandall's Academy for African American female students. And of course, you know about these incidents. In this atmosphere of what William Lloyd Garrison called, quote, Negrophobia or racist hatred, Connecticut's free black community with their independent churches, schools, and fraternal societies took up the torch of abolition and self-help. None more so than African Americans in Hartford. The fight against racial proscription gave black abolitionism a distinctive character. Black abolitionists in Hartford pioneered a theoretical critique of the pseudoscience of race that justified the enslavement of black people and confronted political and legal discrimination. They fought against fugitive slave rendition and at the same time devoted themselves to projects of racial uplift and education for free black people. Their fight for equal rights and opposition to colonization did not mean acquiescence to racist conditions at home. Immigration remained an integral part of Black abolitionist struggle for equality and citizenship. Now, the heartbeat of Hartford's Black community and activism was, of course, the church founded in 1819, when African Americans consigned to the back of churches, galleries, and segregated pews formed a religious society and started worshiping independently. And this had happened before in New York. It had happened, of course, with the famous founding of the AME Church in Philadelphia. In 1826, they purchased land at Talcott and Market Streets, where they built the historic church. The church hosted anti-slavery meetings and lectures, but its outstanding ministers were pioneering Black abolitionists in their own right. Its first pastor was Reverend Hosea Easton. He was the son of James Easton, a Revolutionary War veteran and active in the early National Black Conventions. Like other Black abolitionists who are better known, David Walker of Boston, William Hamilton of New York, William Watkins of Baltimore. If you don't know them, read my book. In the 1820s, Reverend Easton gave voice to an uncompromising abolitionism that rejected colonization and demanded equal rights in this country. In the 1830s, Reverend Easton became the first pastor of what came to be known as the Talcott Street Congregational Church. As part of the pattern of racist and anti-abolitionist violence of the 1830s, mobs attacked his congregants and burned down his church in 1836. Easton spent the last year of his life collecting money to rebuild it. In 1837, the year he died, Garrison and Knapp published his treatise on racism, the first of its kind, accompanied with a eulogy on the dead minister. Signing his book, A Treatise on the Intellectual Character and Civil and Political Condition of the Colored People of the United States and the Prejudice Exercised Towards Them, as simply, quote, a colored man, Easton contended that Egypt and Africa were the birthplace of civilization, and that Europeans were descendants of barbarians. It is remarkable, he wrote, that these, quote, barbarous people, staining their root with blood across the Atlantic, professed intellectual and religious superiority. Disputing modern philosophers of the, quote, Negro character, who compared African Americans to, quote, orangutans, he argued that slavery, not any, quote, hereditary cause, was the determinant of racism. The malignant nature of popular racism had secreted into the, quote, very vitals of the colored population. It was, quote, slavery in disguise, the very essence of hell, evoking Haynes' words. Easton exposed the perniciousness of racism by repeating grotesque racist language in describing Black bodies. And here I differ from some recent historians who claim that Easton had internalized anti-Black racism. Easton, in fact, disputed the emergence of pseudoscience of race, writing, quote, analyze a Black man or anatomize him, and the result of the research is the same as analyzing or anatomizing a white man. Now, Easton died before the abolition movement really took off in Connecticut and Hartford and elsewhere in the North. But his successor, Reverend James W.C. Pennington, would soon emerge as an abolitionist of some renown. And I'm so happy that Capitol is commemorating his legacy. Born enslaved as James Pembroke in Queen Anne's County, Maryland in 1807, the fugitive slave abolitionist escaped from his enslaver and slave catchers at the age of 20. He found shelter with William and Phoebe Wright, a Quaker couple in Adams County, Pennsylvania, active in the abolitionist underground. Pennington learned how to read and write from William Wright, a retired school teacher, and adopted his benefactor's name as a middle name as well as his profession. He eventually settled in Brooklyn, New York, where he quickly became a leading light in its activist free Black community. And there's a wonderful heritage center in Weeksville that I advised that has developed the history of Brooklyn's forgotten black abolitionists. In 1831, Pennington would be elected as a delegate to the first annual meeting of the National Black Convention, founded a year earlier and which convened in Philadelphia. In a short period of 4 years, Pennington had become one of the leading black abolitionists in the country. Even though Pennington's 1849 slave narrative that detailed his early life in slavery and escape was entitled, quote, "The Fugitive Blacksmith," he never practiced blacksmithing as he had done as a skilled enslaved artisan. Instead, he fashioned himself as a teacher, minister, writer, and intellectual of some repute in the transnational abolitionist world. And his indictment of slavery in his narrative is amazing. The chattel principle, that some of you who have read the narrative, of course, may know that slavery embodies the chattel principle. It's not the abuse, it's not anything else, it's reducing human beings to property, which he thought was, of course, against religion and against human rights. Now, in his maiden speech against colonization, on the strength of which he was elected to the National Black Convention, Pennington laid out the African American case for black freedom claims for a homeland in the Americas rather than Africa. As he argued, quote, "Our fathers were among the first that peopled this country. Their sweat and their tears have been the means, in a measure, of raising our country to its present standing." During this time, Pennington most likely acquired a modicum of a classical and religious education in Sunday schools open to African Americans, like some other black abolitionists, such as David Ruggles, who was also born in Connecticut. In 1833, Pennington accepted a position as a teacher in Newtown, Long Island, in a school for black children. In a few years, he left for New Haven to train for the ministry. Now, here's, of course, where he audited classes in Yale. They would not allow him to join in the classes or take out books from the library. In 1840, Pennington assumed pastorship of the Talcott Street Church, and a year later, following Easton's footsteps, he wrote a textbook of the origin and history of the colored people, a moral and biblical indictment of scientific racism commonly deployed to uphold racial slavery, and on emancipation to deny people of African descent any semblance of equality. Now, I should stay there. I thought I had another PowerPoint, but I don't. Using the Bible as his touchstone, Pennington argued that the quote, "the notion of racial inferiority is not only false, but absurd, and therefore should be abandoned." It's like a logician. He put out the statement. He challenged the idea that, quote, "there is an inferior order of intellect, and that those of this order are radically and constitutionally inferior, so that no means can change that constitution or raise them from that order." He contended that, quote, "intellect is identical in all human beings, and is the great distinguishing point between man and brute creation." Pennington gave Jefferson the benefit of the doubt that he had denied to black slaves, writing that the Virginian had, quote, "plainly discovered to the world the adverse influence of slavery on his great mind." These are Jefferson's remarks on race from Notes in the State of Virginia, where he made an exception for black people. More significantly, Pennington developed a sustained moral and philosophical argument against racism. He categorized racism as sacrilegious, supreme selfishness, emphatically ill will, these are all his words, and illuminated its tendency toward violence as illustrated in mob attacks against abolitionists and blacks in the 1830s. Racism was, quote, "a blindness of mind or ignorance, and its resulting vices among whites were, quote, injustice, dishonesty, hypocrisy, and brutish and uncivil manners." It was, according to Pennington, quote, "carrying the total nation to a state of refined heathenism." Pennington portrayed black Americans as superior Christians who must educate, love, and pity these men-hating Christians, unquote. Like Easton, Pennington ran schools from the church, The daughter of one of his congregates, Anne Plato, was a school teacher and published a book of poems with an introduction written by Pennington. So not only did he write, he encouraged people in his congregation to write and publish. Now, two of Plato's poems, The Natives of America and To the First of August, which celebrated British abolition, were overtly anti-slavery and anti-racist. An abolitionist essay by, quote, a colored woman, published in a Hartford Reform journal, may well have been written by her. It called on women to sign petitions against the slave trade. This is the interstate domestic slave trade, even though, quote, our great and wise men in the nation's black law factory have decried that you have no right to ask for mercy, referring, of course, to the congressional gag rule against abolitionist petitions. The headmaster of the Talcott Street School was Augustus Washington, one of the first black daguerreotypists in the country. Washington eventually immigrated to Liberia after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Pennington himself flirted with the idea of immigration to Jamaica in the 1840s. Black abolitionists in Hartford were involved in other forms of anti-slavery activism, including actively freeing the enslaved. James Mars, who became, of course, the deacon of the church, played a role in assisting an enslaved woman, Nancy Jackson, gain her freedom from a Georgia enslaver, James Bullock, as she had resided in Connecticut for 2 years. In 1837 case, Jackson versus Bullock, restricted slaveholders' rights to sojourn in Connecticut, and this was a case that was brought by Mars. The shipboard slave rebellion of Mendi Africans on the Amistad in 1839 brought the international slave trade home to the United States, which of course had abolished the African slave trade in 1808 as permitted by the US Constitution. In Pennington's eyes, with the Amistad rebellion, quote, Ethiopia had stretched forth her hands to God, a favorite biblical quotation among religious black abolitionists like him. Through the Amistad Committee, abolitionists fought the case of the convicted Mendi Africans right up to the Supreme Court for repatriation to Africa and against Spanish demands to remand them to Cuban authorities for condign punishment. And I won't go into this because you all know about this case and you will probably be hearing more about it. Now, Pennington viewed the repatriation of the Mendi rebels as an opportunity to establish a missionary station in Africa. As he wrote, quote, I am humbly of the opinion that the signal act of divine providence, which has to our great joy brought about the liberation of the citizens of Mendi, has brought us under solemn obligations to commence missionary operations in Africa. Now, while he remained opposed to the idea of American colonization for free black people, along with two other black abolitionists, members of his church, Pennington issued a call for the creation of the Union Missionary Society to be held at his church on August 20th, 1841. Pennington's, quote, missionary convention supported the enterprise of African missions, but disavowed colonization. Africa, the society announced, had, quote, a wider field of usefulness and has greater claims upon our sympathy and benevolence than any other part of the world. So he's visualizing missionary work without colonization, unlike what actually happened in Africa with Europeans forming colonies and doing missionary work. African Americans had a religious obligation to the, quote, land which our fathers loved as the land of their nativity. Unlike other American missionary societies, its constitution barred slaveholders from membership. While not barring whites and inviting sympathetic allies to join, the Union Missionary Society was primarily a black organization. Pennington, its president, specifically warned against developing European and American colonies in Africa under the pretext of missionary work. While evangelical abolitionist Lewis Tappan asked Pennington to accompany the Mendi Africans back to Africa and help establish a mission there, he demurred. One can imagine that Pennington's opposition to African colonization and his determination to fight for equal rights in the United States may have played a role in his decision. despite his commitment to anti-slavery missionary work in Africa. In fact, two of his congregants, Henry and Tamar Wilson, did accompany the Mendi rebels back to Africa, to the Mendi mission in Africa, where they both died. Pennington's Union Missionary Society merged with Tappan's Amistad, later Mendi Committee, and while Pennington remained president, Tappan was the treasurer. In 1846, they joined other abolitionist missionary societies active in the West Indies and the West to form the Abolitionist American Missionary Association, destined to play a large part during the Civil War and Reconstruction in the transition from slavery to freedom and in the founding of the most prominently historical black colleges and universities like Hampton, Fisk, and Harvard. And in fact, Hampton was founded by the AMA missionaries, was actually the first person to teach under the Emancipation Tree was a black woman by the name of Mary Peake, who taught enslaved people in slavery and then eventually also in the AMA school. And unfortunately, she died during the war. Pennington lost his leadership role and his indispensable black missionary vision, even though he was in the executive committee of the AMA for a few years. Now, unlike black immigrationists from Paul Cuffey to Martin Delaney, Pennington was never a proponent of immigration to Africa, but he did flirt with the idea of Jamaican immigration in the 1840s. This is after the British had abolished slavery. In 1845, he bade farewell to his Talcott Street Church in Hartford and arrived in Kingston, Jamaica by next year. In his farewell sermon, Pennington argued the Bible condemned slavery as demonstrated in God's, quote, wondrous dealings with the Jews, and the fact that it was inconsistent with the teachings of the gospel. Like many black abolitionists, Pennington celebrated the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, especially after the end of the apprenticeship system in 1838. African American abolitionists were known to celebrate August 1st, the Emancipation Day, rather than the 4th of July. And in 1839, Pennington had delivered a 1st of August address, his first public speech. Pennington went to Jamaica as a missionary, but also as an observer of the results of what was commonly then called the, quote, mighty or great experiment of emancipation. With its overwhelming black majority population and absentee English plantation owners, Jamaica was a free black homeland, but controlled and exploited by British colonialism. Pennington was struck by black representation in every strata of society, from labor to the professions and colonial government in Jamaica. In Pennington's eyes, the experiment in black freedom was an unqualified success and presented a field for missionary and educational work among freed people. As he wrote to Tappan, quote, "Oh, my brother, how great the work is. It is a wonderful field." Pennington's plans for an abolitionist mission in Jamaica was cut short by the death of his first wife, Harriet, and he was forced to return home. But by now, he had become an avid proponent of African American immigration to Jamaica. While he asked his congregation, its female missionary and relief societies and black school children, to pray for and support the Mendi mission, he would recommend Jamaican rather than African immigration. In Kingston, he had founded the Jamaican Hammock Association, a society whose name was redolent of a kind of biblical black nationalism, which would promote the fortunes of the sons of Ham in the United States and Jamaica. At the National Black Convention at Troy in 1847, Pennington headed the Commerce Committee and helped form the Committee on West India Correspondence to promote contacts between the black populations of the two countries. As his Jamaican Hammock Association proposed, such intercourse would, quote, contribute their quota to universal happiness, which is calculated to bind all mankind in one common brotherhood. So kind of a early Pan-African vision that preceded the actual movement against European imperialism in the 20th century. Pennington's advocacy of immigration was no doubt fueled by his own precarity, as his former enslaver refused to allow his allies to purchase his freedom. In his farewell address to his Hartford convention, Pennington had revealed for the first time that he was a fugitive slave. and just before leaving, negotiations to purchase himself and his parents from his master had broken down. Pennington also reminded his congregation of the repeal of Connecticut's personal liberty laws, granting fugitive slaves trial by jury and other legal protections after the 1842 Supreme Court decision in Prigg versus Pennsylvania that had declared them unconstitutional. In his important sermon, "Covenants involving moral wrong are not obligatory upon man," that year, Pennington anticipated abolitionist arguments against the draconian fugitive slave law of 1850. Based on Isaiah chapter 28, verse 8, he's, quote, "And your covenant with death shall be annulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand," he recommended civil disobedience. That is, disobeying laws and covenants that, quote, "binds men to do wrong." This is the very passage that Garrison would evoke in condemning the U.S. Constitution 10 years later. Pennington, of course, was associated with the Tabernite, or the evangelical wing of the abolition movement. But when it came to the Fugitive Slave Clause and laws, he anticipated Garrison's radical views. And, you know, when I was reading this yesterday and writing it, I was thinking about what is happening today and thought, wow, Pennington, we can use him and his ideas even today. So Pennington would also continue to promote Jamaican immigration well after his sojourn there, as if to prove him right. In 1847, a state referendum on black male suffrage was defeated decisively in Connecticut, which had disfranchised them in 1818. As Pennington wrote, quote, "I have been a faithful and orderly citizen of Connecticut for 8 years. The good people of this state are not willing to trust those of my brethren whom I have labored to elevate and myself to cast our votes." Again, very pertinent. The right to vote is still contested. The story of Pennington's intellectual endeavors, his travels to Europe, and his involvement in the pacifist, abolitionist, and evangelical world conventions, which garnered him an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1849, he's the first African American to receive an honorary doctorate, is now, of course, well known. And he received the doctorate for his intellectual work and his work in the international peace movement. In 2011, the University of Heidelberg celebrated its 625th anniversary, and they endowed a Pennington Fellowship and Award, based, of course, on the fact that Pennington was given this award, this doctorate. And they asked me to come and give the inaugural lecture because at that time no one really knew that much about Pennington, even though there are some actually good biographies of Pennington out there. And we got a message from President Barack Obama. And President Obama compared his own rise to the presidency to Pennington's rise, from being a former slave to an internationally recognized abolitionist. And he said that, you know, his journey was a lot like that. That was like the high point of the evening. Now, Pennington would eventually leave Hartford for the Shiloh Presbyterian Church in New York City. Like one of the teachers in the Talcott Street Church, Rebecca Primus, who opened a school for freed people in Maryland after the Civil War, Pennington worked among freed people in Natchez, Mississippi first, and then in Florida during Reconstruction, where he died in 1870. Mars died in Norwalk, Connecticut 10 years later. So before the Civil War, Hartford's activist black community and black ministers had compiled an enviable record of anti-slavery activism, education, community uplift, and intellectual achievement. Their legacy is worth recalling and building upon today. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you very much,
You're
Manisha,
welcome.
for that. We are a little short on time, but if there are one or two questions, we can take them, and then in 5 minutes we need to wrap up and give ourselves a break before we move on to our next item. So are there any questions or comments?
Hi, Manisha. I'm Olivia Chang, a teacher of history across the river at Manchester Community College, and I've told Jeff I've been a big fan of your work for a while, so it's an honor to be here. I had a quick question. You may not have an answer to this, and that's okay. I was wondering if there's any acknowledgement in Pennington's writings about how, if he, so you were talking about how he advocated for missionary work in Africa, not immigration, but missionary work. Did he ever express a hesitancy in doing that as Christianity being part of white colonialism in the Americas, and then he's sort of reversing that? But maybe it's a different case. You know, maybe him really finding the means to abolition in this country through Christianity, maybe it had a different effect if he brought it to Africa.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
It makes total sense. It's a great question, and I think it's one that he wrestled with because he was seeing what was happening. You know, they had opposed the American Colonization Society and the way it had formed a colony in Africa, and they had seen what had happened in Liberia. Where both white and black Americans did not exactly treat Native Americans as their equals. In fact, the legacy continues in Liberia even today, that colonial legacy. So most black abolitionists like Pennington were aware of that. They had seen what happened in Sierra Leone, began as an abolitionist project, degenerated into a British imperial colony. Now, this is before the scramble for Africa and before, Africa was partitioned amongst European powers by the end of the 19th century. But the writing is kind of clear in the world that, Christian missionaries and this whole rhetoric of Christianity versus heathenism, civilization versus savagery, Europeanists versus the other in the world was already there. And I think Pennington sees it. And like a lot of black abolitionists, especially religious black ministers, who are such an important group, they kind of wrestle with this a little bit. And I can see that he doesn't go there. He thinks Jamaica is, he feels more comfortable about working with freed people in Jamaica than he does about going to Africa. And Delaney actually goes to Africa, right? And he has his Niger Valley exploring party and all that. But Pennington is more, he sees it. And there is in his writing a warning about European colonization. He says if we go, we must deal with African kings and nations and let them decide how they come to Christianity. But he's such a fervent evangelical. He really believes Christianity, and Christianity not as a European religion, but Christianity as an African American Christianity, and the Christianity of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and that Christianity that he wants to really talk about. So, but he wrestles with it. You're right; it's not an easy thing. It's a great question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any last question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this. Absolutely excellent. I believe it to be the disregarded history, the ignored history of America. And when we think of today, because for me as an African person, the 1619 Project, critical race theory, the rush to remove the vote from African people in this country, nothing has changed, really. And if you were to interview many African people today, right now, the stories would be somewhat similar. Somewhat similar at every level, I would argue. My question to you relates to Dred Scott, because I'm of the view that the Dred Scott case resolved the abolitionist issue and resolved the questions around, the phenotypes and the craniology and scientific racism. All of that debate about, are they intellectuals, are they not? they deserve to be treated in the same way as indentured Irish people who are coming in, and so on. Dred Scott, I believe, impacts the behavior, the treatment towards African people in the United States today. It is not my view that the 13th Amendment resolved any of that issue around citizenship and nationality. That occurred in 1857. In your research, did you find anything from Pennington, any statements anywhere, that spoke to or speaks to the Dred Scott issue and the Dred Scott question? Because that seems to me to put this idea of, you know, the African as a part of the American society, country, institution, correct? So the Pennington silent on that. And that also coming up your views.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, you know, abolitionists were fighting against slavery and also for black citizenship. That was a two-pronged fight. People forget, they think it was just fighting against slavery in the South. No, they were fighting for black equality. And that's the reason why during Reconstruction you end up with ideas about black citizenship, right? And I wouldn't say that nothing has changed. You know, our fight always, you know, is different in different times. As a historian, I can't say nothing changed because we study change over time. So, you know, it has, but you know, you're right. I mean, you feel as if you're fighting the same battles again and again. You know, who thought the Voting Rights Act would be questioned? Who thought you would have an open white supremacist as being elected by the Electoral College to occupy the presidency? So, you know, you feel sometimes that something is not changed, but the idea of black citizenship, you're right, has always been contested in this country. And the Dred Scott decision, that's what it did, right? The 1850s are a really dismal time for American history, certainly for African Americans. You know, beginning with the Fugitive Slave Law, Kansas, Nebraska, then Dred Scott. And basically Dred Scott said that black people are not citizens. And not only are they not citizens, but they can't even sue, which was, people were stunned because they had been suing in courts, including in Missouri, St. Louis, where Dred and Harriet Scott launched their suit first, for generations. You know, they were human beings and they were allowed at least the common protections of English common law. But the idea that they were not citizens, because in fact they are citizens in the North. In fact, they do vote in certain northern states, not in Connecticut, the Georgia of New England, but all the other New England states. Black men still have the right to vote before the Civil War. So they're a small population, so the idea that they were not citizens, which is Tawney's decision, no rights which a white man is bound to respect, was stunning, not just to black people, but everyone. And everyone said, we are not going to obey this decision, including Lincoln, who made his famous speech that a black man is in a jail with, he says, different locks. Like 100 different locks, and each other person has the key to that lock. And that's what the Dred Scott decision is trying to do, right? It's a great metaphor of trying to attack black freedom and citizenship. So it was really opposed at that time by black and white abolitionists, including by anti-slavery Republican politicians like Lincoln, who was an anti-slavery man but was not an abolitionist. And you know, this is why black citizenship, it becomes a contested issue in national politics throughout the war and after Reconstruction. And the people who bring it to the table and who are always contesting for these rights are black people themselves. That's something that we need to remember. So even though there have been attacks on the idea of equal black citizenship, and there are always some people who seem unable to imagine this country except as a white slaveholding republic, that transition from a slaveholding republic into an interracial democracy that Civil War inaugurated in this country is an ongoing process. And it's constantly being contested, whether it's Confederate monuments, whether it's the Confederate flag or the legacy of the war and Reconstruction. And I think we need to meet it head on and look at this long black tradition, American tradition of opposing racial inequality and establishing Black equality and Black citizenship in this country. So, yeah.
This, in addition, formed the foundation of the birther movement against Barack Obama.
Exactly.
Which many people did not.
Purely racist. Yeah.
So please join me again.